The day I finally confronted my daughter-in-law, she did not even try to deny it, and somehow that was the moment everything inside me broke, not because of what she had done, but because I realized she had been doing it right under my nose for years and I never saw it coming. And if you had asked me even a week before that day, I would have told you she was the one person I trusted the most in my entire life, more than my own employees, more than some of my own friends, maybe even more than my own son, because that is what happens when someone earns your trust slowly, carefully over time, the kind of trust that feels unshakable until the moment it is not. And standing there in my office, looking at her across the desk where I had signed countless checks and built a business from nothing, I remember thinking, this cannot be real, this has to be some kind of misunderstanding. Because the person I was looking at was not just my daughter-in-law, she was part of the family. She was at every holiday dinner, every birthday, every Sunday afternoon barbecue. She knew everything about us, about me, about how I ran things, about where everything was. And that is exactly why what happened hurt the way it did, because this was not some outsider trying to take advantage of me. This was someone who had been invited in, someone I had personally brought into the business, someone I had taught step by step how things worked. Because a few years back when my son married Emily, I remember telling people I got lucky, not just with a daughter-in-law but with someone who actually understood responsibility. She was organized, sharp, calm under pressure, the kind of person who noticed details others ignored. And when she offered to help out with some of the paperwork during a busy season, it felt natural to say yes. At first it was small things, organizing invoices, tracking expenses, helping the office run smoother. And I appreciated that more than I probably ever said out loud. Because running a business is not glamorous, it is long hours, numbers, decisions, and constant pressure. And when someone comes in and makes your life easier, you do not question it, you welcome it, and over time that help turned into something more. She started handling financial reports, then vendor payments, then eventually full access to parts of the system I had never let anyone else touch before. Not because she asked for it directly, but because she earned it piece by piece, and every step felt justified at the time, every step made sense. And if there were ever small things that did not quite add up, I brushed them off without thinking twice, because trust has a way of making you ignore the things you should probably pay attention to. And I remember one specific moment, just a minor discrepancy in a monthly report, nothing big, just a number that seemed slightly off, and when I asked about it, she explained it quickly, confidently, and I accepted it without digging deeper, because why would I not? She had never given me a reason to doubt her, not once, and that right there is what I keep coming back to. That one moment, because looking back now, that might have been the first crack, the first sign that something was not right, but at the time it felt like nothing, just part of the normal ups and downs of running a business, and I moved on just like I always did, trusting the system, trusting the people in it, trusting her, never realizing that while I was focused on growing the business, someone I trusted completely was quietly taking advantage of every bit of access I had given them. And the truth is, I did not start out looking for anything wrong. I was not suspicious, I was not paranoid, I was just doing what I had always done, trying to keep everything running smoothly. And if there was anything off, I told myself it would show eventually, because things like that always do, or at least that is what I believed, right up until the moment I realized just how long this had been going on and how deep it actually went. If I am being honest, there was never a single moment where everything suddenly felt wrong. It was not like a switch flipping overnight, it was slower than that, quieter, almost invisible, because the truth is people do not question what works, and everything around me seemed to be working just fine. The business was stable, revenue was consistent, operations were smooth, and in many ways things actually felt easier than they had in years, and that was exactly why I did not look closer, because when something feels easier, you assume it is better, you assume the system is improving, not breaking, and Emily had become such a central part of that system that removing her from the equation was something I could not even imagine at the time. She was the one who would arrive early, leave late, double-check numbers, remind me about deadlines I would have otherwise forgotten, and over time I stopped reviewing certain things myself, not completely, but enough that there were gaps, small spaces where I relied on her word instead of my own verification, and each time I did that it felt justified, because she had proven herself again and again. And what made it even easier was the fact that no one else ever raised any concerns either. My staff trusted her, vendors respected her, even my accountant would sometimes comment on how organized everything had become, and hearing that only reinforced my belief that I had made the right decision, giving her more responsibility. And if there were ever moments where something felt slightly off, it was always easy to explain away, a delayed payment here, a small inconsistency there. Nothing that could not be attributed to timing, human error, or just the normal complexity of running a business, and I told myself that this is what growth looks like. Things get more complicated, not necessarily worse, and I leaned into that belief because it was comfortable, because questioning it would have meant questioning her. And I did not want to do that, not just because of the business but because of what it would mean for the family. And that is something I do not think people talk about enough, how much harder it is to see the truth when it is tied to someone you care about, because every doubt feels like a betrayal in itself, like you are the one doing something wrong just by thinking it. So instead of asking more questions, I asked fewer. Instead of digging deeper, I moved on faster. And over time that became a pattern, one that I did not even recognize until much later. And there was one afternoon that stands out to me now, even though at the time it seemed completely ordinary. I was reviewing a quarterly summary, nothing unusual, just going through numbers the way I always did. And there was a line item that caught my attention, not because it was large, but because it was unfamiliar. Something about it did not match the way we usually categorized expenses. And I remember pausing for a second, just long enough to notice it, but not long enough to question it seriously. And when I asked Emily about it, she answered without hesitation, calm, precise, confident, explaining that it was part of a new vendor structure we had recently adjusted. And she even showed me a document to back it up, and I nodded, accepted it, and moved on because everything about her response felt right. The tone, the timing, the detail, it all aligned with the version of her I believed in, and that is what made it so effective. Because the truth did not come wrapped in something obvious or suspicious, it came wrapped in normalcy and professionalism, in the exact behavior I had come to expect from her. And that is why I did not see it, not then, not even close. And if anything, moments like that made me trust her more, because she always had an answer, always had a solution, always made things easier. And looking back now, that is the part that unsettles me the most. Not just that it happened, but how perfectly it fit into the life I thought I understood. Because nothing felt broken, nothing felt out of place, and yet somehow everything already was. What made everything even harder to see was how naturally her role kept expanding, because it never felt like a sudden shift. It felt like a series of logical steps that anyone in my position would have made. And I remember telling myself more than once that this was exactly what I had needed all along. Someone dependable, someone consistent, someone who could take pressure off my shoulders without creating new problems. And Emily did that better than anyone I had ever worked with. She anticipated issues before they surfaced, she followed up on details that others ignored, and she carried herself in a way that made people listen, which in a business like mine matters more than most people realize, because authority is not just about position, it is about perception, and she had both. And over time I noticed that people started going to her before coming to me, not in a way that felt disrespectful, but in a way that felt efficient, and I allowed that because it made sense, because it freed me up to focus on bigger decisions, long-term planning, expansion opportunities, and the kind of thinking that keeps a business moving forward. And in doing so, I unintentionally created distance between myself and the daily operations, not completely, but enough that I was no longer seeing everything firsthand. I was seeing it through reports, summaries, conversations, and most of those came through her, which meant that my understanding of the business was increasingly filtered, shaped by what she chose to present and how she chose to present it. And again, at the time, that did not feel like a problem. It felt like structure, it felt like growth, because as a business gets larger, you cannot personally verify every transaction, every document, every detail. You rely on systems and people. And I believed I had both. I believed the system was solid and the person managing it was trustworthy. And that combination gave me a level of confidence that in hindsight was misplaced, but at the time felt completely justified. And there was one period where everything seemed almost too smooth, fewer issues, fewer delays, fewer unexpected costs, and I remember even mentioning it to a colleague, saying that things had finally reached a point where they were running the way I had always hoped they would. And he nodded, agreed, and said that meant I had built a strong team. And I accepted that as confirmation that I was on the right track, because when you hear something you already believe coming from someone else, it reinforces that belief in a way that is hard to challenge. And that is exactly what happened. I stopped questioning things, not because I was careless, but because everything around me suggested there was nothing to question. And if there were any inconsistencies, they were buried under layers of normal activity, small enough to blend in, spaced out enough to avoid patterns, and explained well enough to satisfy any brief concern. And looking back now, I can see how deliberate that must have been, how carefully everything was managed to avoid attention, because nothing was ever obvious, nothing ever stood out long enough to trigger real suspicion. And that is what made it so effective, because it allowed me to stay comfortable, to stay confident, to stay unaware. And there was a point where I realized I had not personally reviewed certain financial details in weeks, maybe longer, not because I could not, but because I did not feel the need to, and that realization did not alarm me at the time. It reassured me, because it meant I trusted the system, it meant I trusted her. And I told myself that this was what delegation looked like, this was what leadership required. Letting go of control in the right areas, trusting the right people, focusing on what mattered most. And if anyone had told me then that something was wrong, I probably would have defended her without hesitation, because in my mind there was no reason not to. Everything I saw, everything I experienced, everything I believed pointed to the same conclusion, that she was not just helping the business, she was strengthening it, and that belief stayed intact right up until the moment a single detail refused to fit into that picture. A detail so small it should have been easy to ignore, but for some reason this time it was not, and that was the first time I felt something shift, not enough to understand what was happening, but enough to know that something was different, something I could not explain, and that feeling, as subtle as it was, would end up changing everything. It was nothing significant on its own, just a number that appeared slightly out of place, but this time it stayed with me longer than it should have, not because it was large or alarming, but because it did not behave the way it should have when I tried to move past it, and that was new for me because I had ignored small inconsistencies before without a second thought, but this one lingered quietly, almost like a question I could not fully hear yet could not completely silence either, and I remember closing the report, leaning back in my chair, and telling myself it was nothing, just another normal fluctuation, but instead of moving on like I usually did, I opened it again, and that simple decision, something I had not done in a long time, was the first real deviation from the pattern I had been following for years, because normally I would have accepted the explanation already stored in my mind, the same set of assumptions I had relied on over and over again, but this time something held me there, and I started looking just a little closer, not in a full investigation, not yet, but enough to notice that the number connected to a category I did not fully recognize, and when I traced it back, it led to a vendor name that sounded familiar but not specific, like something I had heard before without ever focusing on it, and that was the second moment that made me pause, because familiarity without clarity is a strange thing. It gives you just enough comfort to ignore something while still leaving a gap you cannot quite explain. And I sat there trying to recall where I had seen it before, going through recent conversations, emails, reports, but nothing stood out clearly, and that was when I did something I had not done in a long time. I checked it myself without asking anyone first, just quietly, just to confirm what I thought I already knew. And at first everything seemed to align. The documentation was there, the transaction was recorded, the amounts were reasonable, and for a moment I felt that familiar sense of reassurance, the feeling that I had overthought something simple, but then I noticed the timing, not incorrect, just slightly inconsistent with the usual pattern, not enough to trigger an alert, but enough to stand out if you were paying attention, and that was the key difference. This time I was paying attention, and the more I looked, the more I realized that while each individual detail could be explained on its own, together they did not form a pattern I fully understood, and that unsettled me in a way I could not immediately define because I was not looking at anything obviously wrong. I was looking at something that did not feel entirely right, and those two things are very different, and I remember thinking that maybe I had simply been too removed from the day-to-day operations, that maybe the system had evolved in ways I was no longer fully aware of, and that thought almost convinced me to stop right there, to close everything again and move on like I had done so many times before. But something about the way this felt would not let me, and instead of asking Emily directly like I normally would have, I decided to wait, not out of suspicion exactly, but out of a need to understand it myself first, and that decision changed the direction of everything, because for the first time I was not relying on her explanation to make sense of what I was seeing, I was relying on my own, and that created a small but important shift in perspective, one that allowed me to see things I might have otherwise missed. And as I continued to look carefully, quietly, without drawing attention, I started to notice that this was not an isolated instance, it was just the first one I had truly recognized, and that realization did not come all at once, it came gradually, piece by piece, like something forming just outside of clear view. And even then I did not fully understand what I was looking at, but I knew enough to realize that if I wanted answers, I was going to have to look deeper than I ever had before, and that was the moment where trust began to give way to doubt, not fully, not yet, but enough to change how I saw everything that followed. At that point I could have stopped, and part of me wanted to, because the easiest thing to do when something feels uncertain is to return to what feels familiar. And for me that meant trusting her, trusting the system, trusting the version of reality I had been comfortable with for years. And I remember sitting there thinking that maybe I was overanalyzing something small, that maybe this was just what happened when you look too closely at anything, you start to see patterns that are not really there, and that thought almost pulled me back into the same routine I had followed for so long. But there was something different now, something I could not ignore as easily as before, and instead of closing everything and moving on, I decided to take one more step, just a small one, just enough to confirm that everything was still as solid as I believed it to be. And I told myself that once I did that I would let it go, I would return to normal, because I did not want to create problems where there were none, and I especially did not want to question someone I had trusted for so long without a clear reason, and that is something I struggled with more than I expected, because every time I looked at a detail that did not fully make sense, I felt like I was doing something wrong, like I was the one crossing a line, not her, and that internal conflict slowed me down. It made me hesitate, it made me second-guess even the simplest observations, and I found myself justifying things before I even fully understood them, telling myself that there had to be a reasonable explanation, that there always was, and for a while that belief held because nothing I saw was obvious, nothing was clearly out of place, everything still looked normal on the surface, and that is what made it so difficult, because I was not dealing with something that was clearly broken, I was dealing with something that was almost perfectly intact, and the more I looked, the more I realized that whatever was happening, if anything was happening at all, it was subtle, controlled, and spread out in a way that avoided attention. And that realization did not come with clarity, it came with more questions, because if I could not see a clear pattern, then what exactly was I looking for? And for the first time I started to consider the possibility that I had missed something important, not just recently but over a much longer period of time, and that thought was uncomfortable, because it challenged the way I saw myself, the way I ran my business, the way I judged people, and I did not want to believe that I could have overlooked something significant for that long, so instead of accepting that possibility, I pushed back against it. I told myself that if there was something wrong, it would have been obvious by now, that problems do not stay hidden forever, that eventually something breaks, something surfaces, something forces your attention, and since that had not happened, I convinced myself that I was still in control, that everything was still functioning the way it should, and that this was just a momentary doubt that would pass. But even as I told myself that, I kept looking just a little, just enough to ease my mind, and that is when I noticed something that did not fit as easily into the explanations I had been relying on, not a major issue, not something dramatic, but something consistent enough to stand out once I stopped ignoring it. And that was when the feeling changed, not completely, but enough that I could no longer pretend it was nothing, because for the first time I was not just seeing isolated details, I was starting to see connections, and even though those connections were still unclear, still incomplete, they pointed in a direction I had not been willing to consider before, and that was the moment I realized that whatever this was, it was not going to disappear just because I wanted it to. And if I wanted to understand it, I was going to have to face it directly, even if that meant questioning everything I thought I knew. Once I accepted that I needed to look deeper, everything about the way I approached the business began to shift, not outwardly, not in a way anyone else would notice, but internally, in the way I observed, in the questions I asked myself before asking anyone else. And for the first time in years, I stopped taking things at face value and started verifying them quietly, carefully, without drawing attention, because I did not want to create tension based on something I still could not fully explain, and at that stage I was not trying to prove anything, I was trying to understand, and that distinction mattered because it kept me focused on details instead of conclusions, and the more I revisited past records, the more I realized how much I had relied on summaries instead of raw data, how often I had accepted the final numbers without tracing where they came from, and now, going back through those same records with a different perspective, I started to notice small inconsistencies that I had never questioned before, patterns that were not obvious unless you were specifically looking for them, and that was the turning point, because once you see a pattern, even a faint one, it changes everything, it shifts your mindset from trust to scrutiny, and suddenly the same information that once reassured you begins to raise new questions, and I remember pulling reports from different time periods, not just recent ones but months, even years back, comparing them side by side, not in a formal audit, just a personal review, and what stood out was not any single transaction, but the repetition of certain structures, similar categories, similar timing, similar adjustments that always seemed reasonable on their own but began to feel less random when viewed together. And that was when I realized this was not something new. This had been happening for a while, longer than I was comfortable admitting, and that realization brought a different kind of weight, because it meant that if something was wrong, it was not an isolated mistake, it was part of a system, something that had been maintained consistently over time. And that is when the question changed for me. It was no longer about whether something was off, it was about how long it had been off and how I had missed it, and that question was harder to face than anything else, because it forced me to confront my own role in all of this, not as someone who had been intentionally misled, but as someone who had allowed certain things to go unquestioned, and that is a difficult position to accept, because it blurs the line between trust and oversight, between confidence and complacency, and I found myself going back to specific moments, conversations, decisions, trying to pinpoint when things might have started shifting, when the balance between delegation and awareness had tipped too far. And while I could not identify a single moment where everything changed, I could see a gradual progression, a series of small decisions that collectively created the conditions for something like this to happen without being noticed, and that realization did not come with clarity or closure, it came with more urgency, because now I knew that if there was something there, it was deeper than I had initially thought, And understanding it was not going to be as simple as reviewing a few reports, it was going to require a level of attention I had not given the business in a long time, and more importantly, it was going to require me to look at the people around me differently, not with suspicion but with awareness, and that was the hardest part. Because once you start questioning what you once trusted, there is no easy way to go back, and even though I still had not confronted anyone, still had not voiced any of these concerns out loud, something had already changed because I was no longer seeing things the same way. And I knew that whatever came next, it was not going to be simple, and it was not going to be easy to ignore. The more I followed those patterns, the harder it became to ignore what they were pointing toward, because what had once felt like isolated inconsistencies was beginning to take on a structure, something deliberate, something repeated too precisely to be accidental. And I remember sitting alone after hours with spreadsheets open across my desk, tracing numbers back to their origins, cross-referencing dates, vendors, and internal notes, and at first I kept hoping I would reach a point where everything aligned again, where the pattern would break and confirm that I had simply misunderstood what I was seeing. But that moment never came. Instead, the opposite happened. The more I checked, the more consistent the irregularities became, and that was when the weight of it truly started to settle in, because consistency means intention, and intention means someone made a choice, and once that thought entered my mind, everything shifted again, because now I was no longer just analyzing data, I was considering the possibility that someone I trusted had been actively shaping that data over time, and even then I resisted jumping to conclusions. I told myself there could still be an explanation I had not seen yet, something procedural, something external, something that did not involve deliberate action, and to test that, I began looking beyond the internal records, reaching out quietly to a few vendors under the pretense of routine follow-up, asking simple questions about timelines, invoices, confirmations, nothing that would raise concern, just enough to compare what they reported with what was documented in our system. And that was where things started to diverge in a way that could not be explained as easily, because in several cases the details did not fully match, not dramatically, not in a way that would immediately signal a major issue, but enough that when placed alongside everything else I had already seen, it added another layer to the pattern I could no longer ignore. And I remember one specific call where the representative mentioned a billing schedule that did not align with what I had in front of me, and when I asked about it casually, they clarified it without hesitation, as if it was completely normal, and that clarity was what made it stand out, because it meant the discrepancy was not on their side, it was on ours, and that realization narrowed the possibilities in a way that was difficult to avoid, because if the external information was consistent and the internal records were not, then the issue was not random, it was somewhere within the system I had trusted, and by extension within the group of people who managed it. And that was the point where I had to confront a question I had been avoiding from the beginning, not whether something was wrong, but who had the access, the knowledge, and the opportunity to make it happen. And when I looked at it from that perspective, the list became very short, shorter than I was comfortable with, and I found myself going through roles, permissions, responsibilities, mapping out who could do what and how often, and each path I followed seemed to lead back to the same place, not directly, not in a way that provided immediate proof, but in a way that connected more pieces than anything else, and I did not want to accept that, not yet, so I kept looking, searching for another explanation, another connection that would make more sense, something that would redirect my attention away from where it was starting to focus. But every time I traced the pattern again, every time I reviewed the structure of how things were handled, the same alignment appeared, subtle but persistent, and that persistence is what made it impossible to dismiss, because random issues do not repeat themselves in the same controlled way over long periods of time, and by then I understood that whatever this was, it had been maintained carefully, consistently, and quietly, and the only question left was how much of it there was and how far it actually went, and that was the moment I knew I was no longer just reviewing the past, I was uncovering something that had been intentionally hidden, and whether I was ready or not, I was already too far in to stop. By the time I reached that point, I was no longer trying to convince myself that everything was normal. I was trying to understand how something like this could exist for so long without ever fully revealing itself. And the only way to do that was to go deeper than I ever had before, not just reviewing summaries or quarterly reports, but examining individual transactions one by one across different time periods, looking for continuity, looking for repetition, looking for anything that could confirm whether what I was seeing was real or just a misinterpretation. And as I did that, the picture became clearer, not all at once but gradually, like something coming into focus after being blurred for years. And what I started to notice was not just a pattern, but a method, a way in which certain transactions were structured to appear ordinary while subtly shifting amounts, timing, or categorization just enough to avoid detection. And what made it even more unsettling was how consistent that method was, how it adapted over time, changing just enough to stay aligned with the way the business evolved, which meant this was not something accidental, this was something maintained, adjusted, and repeated with intention. And that realization changed everything because it meant I was not looking at isolated errors, I was looking at a system, and systems do not operate without someone guiding them. And as I continued tracing those connections, I began to map out the scope of it, not just where it appeared, but how often, how regularly, and over what span of time. And that was when the timeline started to stretch further back than I expected. Months turned into years, small discrepancies accumulated into something much larger when viewed collectively. And even though no single instance stood out as extreme, together they formed a pattern that was impossible to dismiss. And I remember sitting there late at night, going through records from years prior, realizing that this had been happening long before I ever had a reason to question anything. And that realization brought a different kind of weight because it was not just about what was happening now, it was about everything I had missed before, every report I had approved, every decision I had made based on information I believed was accurate. And that is when the emotional impact started to set in. Not as a sudden reaction, but as a slow realization that the trust one had built over time had been used in a way I never anticipated, and what made it even harder was that I still had not said anything to anyone. I was carrying all of this alone, processing it internally, trying to balance what I was seeing with what I felt, because part of me still wanted to believe there was another explanation, something I had overlooked, something that could make sense of it without leading to the conclusion that was becoming harder to avoid. But every new detail I uncovered reinforced the same direction, the same connection, the same possibility, and eventually I reached a point where I could no longer separate the data from the person behind it, because the access required, the knowledge needed, the consistency maintained over time all pointed toward someone who understood the system as well as I did, someone who had been involved long enough to know exactly how to move within it without drawing attention. And when I allowed myself to fully consider that, even for a moment, everything else faded because the implications were no longer abstract, they were personal. And that was the moment I realized that what I was uncovering was not just a financial issue, it was something that had been built into the very structure of the trust one had given. And once that realization took hold, there was no going back to how things were before, because now I was not just asking what happened, I was asking why. And that question was far more difficult to face than anything I had discovered so far. By the time I reached that realization, the question was no longer whether I should confront her, it was how, because once you understand something at that level, you cannot pretend you do not. And yet at the same time, acting on it means changing everything, not just in the business but in the family, and that is a line I did not cross lightly because this was not just an employee or a partner. This was someone who sat at my dinner table, someone who had been part of my daily life for years. And I remember thinking that if I was wrong, if somehow I had misinterpreted everything, the damage from even asking the question could not be undone, but if I was right, then not asking it would be worse because it would mean allowing something to continue that I now knew existed. And that internal conflict stayed with me for days, maybe longer, as I went back over everything one more time, not looking for new information, but confirming what I already knew, making sure that when I finally spoke, I would not be relying on assumptions but on facts. And once I reached that point, there was a kind of clarity that replaced the uncertainty I had been carrying. Not comfort but certainty, and with that came a decision I could no longer delay, and I chose a moment that felt controlled, private, without distractions, because I did not want this to unfold in a way that would create unnecessary tension or confusion. And when she walked into the office that day, nothing about her behavior suggested anything had changed. She was calm, composed, exactly the way she had always been, and for a brief moment I wondered if I was about to disrupt something that did not need to be disrupted. But that thought passed as quickly as it came because I knew what I had seen, and I knew what it meant, and when I finally spoke, I did not accuse, I did not raise my voice, I simply laid out what I had found step by step, calmly, clearly, allowing the facts to speak for themselves, and then I waited because in that moment her response mattered more than anything I could say, and what happened next is something I will not forget, not because it was dramatic but because it was not. There was no confusion, no denial. No attempt to explain it away the way smaller things had been explained in the past. Instead there was a pause, a quiet acknowledgement that told me everything I needed to know without a single word, and that silence confirmed what the numbers had already shown. And in that moment the situation shifted from something I had been investigating to something I had to accept, and that acceptance came with a weight I was not fully prepared for because it was not just about the business anymore, it was about trust, about how easily it can be given and how difficult it is to rebuild once it is broken. And as I sat there processing it, I realized that the most difficult part was not what had been done, but how long it had been done without being seen, and what that said about the way I had been operating, the assumptions I had made, the confidence I had placed in the wrong place at the wrong time. And while I knew that moving forward would require decisions, changes, and boundaries that had not existed before, what stayed with me most was the understanding that trust without verification is not strength, it is exposure, and that lesson, more than anything else, is what I carry with me now, because once you learn it this way, you do not forget it, and you do not ignore it again.